In front of me here, I'm delighted, it's Frank here, and also my grandfather, Frank Shouldice. With my brothers and sister, we lived with Grandpa in Clontarf until he died in 1974. He was 83 when he passed away. I was 11. So what did I know about him at that stage? Well, I knew he'd been involved in the Rising. I knew because he had medals with ribbons. I knew because he had a 1966 calendar with Patrick Pearse on the wall, and I knew also because he had friends who we knew at the time as old IRA men, and he went to the Easter commemorations, and I was lucky enough that he brought me to Arbour Hill. And as a kid you'd be walking around and it'd be like surrounded by these elderly proud men, and you didn't know what it was about, but there was something solemn and dignified about it, and I'd always thought that there was something that I'd return to later. The other thing I knew about him as a kid was that he'd once escaped from prison, and when you're an 11-year-old, the idea of your granddad busting out of jail is something to fire the imagination. So I suppose these are facts, kind of historical details. In day-to-day life for us, he was Grandpa. He used a walking stick, he usually wore a hat or a beret, nearly always wore a tie, he had braces over his shirt. He liked the pipe, Condor plugged tobacco, which he'd pair with a small silver penknife that he had. He drove a Hillman Imp, later upgraded to a Mini, and I think it's safe to say in his later years he drove slowly. On Sunday he often brought me to matches in Croke Park, and he'd lift me over the turnstile and I'd squeeze into the seat beside him, and we'd be watching games, and it never occurred to me that he had played inter-county football for Dublin and later for his native Mayo, because he never said anything about it. It was like, you could put it down to modesty or humility, but he never sought attention for himself, and he'd shy away from it when it came his way. And I think it was a lot of Grandpa's story, that it was kind of an interior life where personal achievements weren't spoken about, or actually not referred to at all. For instance, actually the 50th anniversary of the Rising, he was asked to unveil a plaque in Boyle in County Roscommon, and he was asked to come down, and he was flattered to be asked, but he declined. And he said, but his reply actually told a lot about him, because he wrote back and he said, "I have never aspired, unfortunately perhaps, to the art of public speaking, and realising my own inadequacy, would prefer if someone more practiced in it were called on. To be quite candid, I was never made fill the role of public speaker. I'm afraid I belong with the backroom boys, and I'm too old to change." So you could say today's story is a story about the backroom boys. Not big names from the pantheon of Irish history, but the ordinary fellas who gave their all without hesitation and never asked for anything in return. And I knew from the visits to Croke Park that he had a very fond appreciation for the underdog, that he was very proud of where he came from, which is Balladreen. He considered himself a Mayo man, a man from the West. Now, the town did get moved into Roscommon in 1898, but that didn't change Grandpa's sense of belonging. And you could hear it in his voice, which was soft and rural. I don't remember hearing him sing, but he had, by all accounts, a fine baritone. Frank and his older brother Jack went to London, and that's when they were over there at separate times. They met up with Sam Maguire. That's when they joined the IRB. There were 10 years between Frank and Jack, but they were more like best mates. They were both pretty handy footballers, and in fact 2 weeks before the Rising they were both playing in the final of the Croke Cup for Dublin. Little did they know it would take a few years to pick up their medals. So I thought for the day that's in it, and for all of you who are here, that we go back to, let's go back 102 years to what happened here, right here in this building, within these walls. And to do so as far as possible in the words of the people who are here. So Reilly's fort always had a particular significance for Grandpa, and even more so for Jack, because Jack was he commanded the post here as part of the Four Courts Garrison under Ned Daly. So sometimes I think we might underestimate the level of military planning that went into this. It was Brian Cody from Skerries he was with G Company in 1st Battalion Dublin Brigade, and he made a very interesting point about events leading up to the Rising. He said, in his statement to the Bureau of Military History, he said, lectures on street fighting and the construction of barricades and roadblocks were given to us at regular intervals. All men were expected to acquaint themselves with the layout of streets, important buildings, entrances to factories, position of windows, and any other information which could be of use in the course of the Rising. In fact, Jack did extensive recce's of the area around here with fellow officers Fionn Lynch and Diarmuid O'Hegarty. And in his statement to the Bureau, Jack explained it like this. He said the plan was to defend the crossing. So when he said the crossing, we were talking about Church Street and North King Street. So it was to defend the crossing from enemy attacks coming from British barracks west of Smithfield, from military posts such as Broadstone Railway Station and North Dublin Union, to keep the crossing open for our own forces and for the Four Courts, and to maintain a line of communication with the garrison from the GPO. So you get a sense of where they saw themselves fitting into the Rising plan. They had also plans to take Broadstone Railway Station, but they didn't have the numbers, so that was called off. But anyway, the homework they did leading up to the Rising did pay off. Anyone from around here will know well that this whole area has changed massively from time gone by. Most of the buildings around us would have been a lot lower back at the turn of the century. Church Street and North King Street still ran the same direction, but road widening has changed the streetscape here completely beyond recognition. So across the road, the buildings would have been a lot nearer, and the intersection was a lot tighter, a lot narrower. And that made this building really well chosen for street warfare because it dominated the intersection without being exposed the way it would be now. So it's hard to visualize that, but if it's a lot tighter and it becomes an absolute impediment to get around it. So like thousands of Irish volunteers on the Sunday, the Shouldice brothers went home after the countermanding order came in. Frank and Jack, they were sharing a flat in the Crescent in Fairview, and it was just a few doors away from Harry Boland. They were very good friends with the Boland family. So then on Monday, when the order to mobilise came in, Kathleen Boland, who lived with the Boland family, she recalls that morning, and she said that she remembers her brother Harry come running in and said to my mother, "I have to go out, the other boys are going." She asked, "Who are they?" He replied, "Jack Shouldice, Frank Shouldice, and many others." She said, "Go. In the name of God, your father would haunt you if you didn't do the right thing." Easter Monday had arrived. Sean O'Duffy made his way in here from A Company. He came in from the South Circular Road, and leaving his home, he remembers going out the back door in full equipment. In his words, "My mother gave me a dash of holy water and I told her not to drown me." 19-year-old John Kenny from Belvedere Avenue up off North Circular Road, he came to F Company with his brother Michael. And in his words, he said, "We set out having said goodbye. My father showed emotion, but my mother was calm and controlled. She gave us her blessing and told us to fight well. She added, 'Remember that your deaths are ordained by God and not by the British,'" which is an extraordinary thing to say to her sons. Sean Cody made his way in anyway, and he carried a Lee Enfield rifle with him. On his way in, he was stopped by a soldier who was a recruiting officer for the British Army. Sean Cody also had a revolver in his pocket, and fearing that the soldier was going to detain him, he had his hand in his pocket and literally gun at the ready. So fortunately, the soldier said he could let him go on his way. It was a small, tense drama, but typical of what was playing out Easter Monday all over the city. So the Four Courts Garrison gathered in St. Columkille's Hall in Blackhall Place down behind us. It was 11:30, and they were reduced to about a third of the normal complement. Sean O'Duffy said, Commandant Daly went to the stage and said he had an announcement to make to us which he desired to be heard without cheers. He said, "Today we shall declare an Irish Republic, and inside 1 hour we may be in action. Following this, there was a general buzz of excitement, and some shook hands, saying the day had come. Ned Daly did give his men an option. He said you were in or you were out, so anybody who wanted to could go. And that was it. So after all the planning, the training, the waiting, here they were. Frank and Jack were late actually into that. They weren't at St. Columkille's Hall because they were rousting up other volunteers on their way in from the Crescent in Fairview. And in fact, on the way in, they bumped into a fellow they knew, Padder Lawless, a fellow they knew from playing football. And he was on his way home, and they said, "It's on." And he says, "I don't have a gun." And they said, "We'll get you a gun. If you join us, we'll get you a gun." Padder Lawless thought about it, and he decided against. And he went home to number 27 North King Street. So the brothers came here directly. The barricades were already being put up in the street right outside that window. And Jack estimated there was about 20 volunteers at the time, half of them in uniform. They had 12 .303 rifles, half a dozen Holt rifles, a few revolvers and 6 bayonets. The bayonets weren't used in the end. And many years later he told the Bureau, he said, one of the corner houses was unoccupied, and that's this building here. He said it bore the name of Reilly on the signboard. We removed 3 windows and fortified the place with sacks of flour and meal. During the week it became known as Reilly's Fort and served as good shelter and a place of rest for the first 2 or 3 days. Communications were made through Reilly's and the adjoining houses to Upper Church Street, by boring through the walls with crowbars up into North Brunswick Street. And it is funny to think that a key part of an armed Irish insurrection would involve breaking into a pub. But Pearse Beasley, who was Vice Commandant of the 1st Battalion, he remembers, Lieutenant Shouldice thought it prudent to ensure that none of his men would be tempted by the liquor. He ordered that all the bottles be smashed to the ground, and this was done. Sean Cody, he did sentry duty up the road on Church Street, and one of the first people he stopped was a British cavalry soldier on his way to Fairyhouse races. It's a kind of indicative of how unexpected this was on a sleepy bank holiday Monday, and how unprepared the British authorities were to actually deal with it. So what's unexpected invites the unpredictable. Street lights were doused so that by the time night fell, this was in pitch darkness. Michael O'Flanagan, one of 4 O'Flanagan brothers who came out, did sentry duty on Church Street as well, and he remembers 4 or 5 men and women coming from Mary's Lane. Between them they were carrying a piano, which we conclude they had stolen from some business premises. We called on them to halt, but they refused to do so. We fired a few shots over their heads as a warning, and they dropped the piano and moved off. It's just suddenly everything was changed. So when it came to handling a rifle, Grampan was regarded as a bit of a sharpshooter. So he was posted with a few others up the Jemison Malthouse in Beresford Street. That tower is long gone, but what it gave the volunteers was height and a sniper's post with elevation. So he would use that position to deadly effect later in the week. It really can't be understated that this was a completely new experience for all of these men, because apart from those who had fought with the British Army, none of them had ever shot at anybody or been shot at. And it's all very well doing target practice in the underground firing range in Parnell Square. This was the real thing. And the thing about real living targets is they shoot back. So on Monday, several Lancers came down Constitution Hill on horseback. One of them was shot and injured, and he dropped his lance. So someone went out, grabbed the lance, planted it in a barrel at the crossroads here, and put Ned Daly's green and gold flag, and it flew there all week, defiantly. The first serious opposition F Company ran into was actually from local women. Now it's well documented that in this area so many families depended completely on remittances from husbands or sons who were fighting for the British Army, and their fear was that the rising would jeopardise these payments, which was the only money they had coming into the house, and the women didn't mind letting the volunteers know what they thought of it. Liam Archer, who was down here, he had a very colourful turn of phrase, and he remembers a buxom fishwife dressed in what he called a voluminous shawl, who, as he said, proceeded in the traditional Dublin manner to work herself into a frenzy by beating her ample bosom with her fists and calling on me to put it through me for the sake of my son who's out in France. And he finishes that story with a phrase that always reminds me of Mickey Rooney. He said, "We steered a wide course round that angry dame." According to Jack Shouldice, we were able to cook for the first few days in the fireplace in Reilly's. I'm not sure where the fireplace is, but after the cooking ceased after that, 2 members of the company did the cooking, and the meals generally consisted of rashers, eggs, tea and stew. Meanwhile, up on the roof, things had changed all dramatically, and as he said himself, bullets spattered around the chimneys of Reilly's fort, where some of our snipers, including Tom Sheeran, William Murphy, Michael O'Kelly, were busy sniping enemy posts. The rooftop soon got too hot for our men, who were forced to come down. Soon, the bright glow of O'Connell Street, if you can picture where that is, and the burning of the Linen Hall barracks up the road, that would turn night into day. Wednesday. Because of the losses Grandpa was inflicting from the Malthouse, British snipers naturally tried to get him, and they nearly succeeded. A bullet grazed his cheek and hit the wall right behind him. Grandpa put it down to extreme good luck that he actually turned away at the second that he was shot at. And had that bullet found its mark, there's a thought. And it brings home really the huge consequence of small margins. If you're talking about an inch to the left or the right, there'd be somebody else talking here today. The noose was already tightening, and if we try to imagine what it was like in these very rooms, I thought maybe we could listen to what Liam O'Doherty said. And he said, so picture yourself here and on the floor upstairs. He said, it wasn't possible to move from one room to another except on hands and knees, as every window was covered by snipers, and owing to the constant fire they kept up. The men here and around North King Street knew it was only a matter of time. British reinforcements had arrived, and the volunteers would soon be outnumbered by 20 to 1. So imagine that, 20 to 1. Thursday, Sean Cody wrote, on Thursday the British advanced from Bolton Street up North King Street, firing in all directions. Severe fighting was taking place at the barricade near Reilly's public house, which held Lieutenant Shouldice's men. Frank Henderson watched it all unfold, and he said, the military were closing in from east and west in an effort to complete the planned cordon, and fighting became particularly fierce. 250 troops established headquarters in Bolton Street School and started probing forward up North King Street. They were constantly under fire from Reilly's fort, which held 8 men under Sergeant Shouldice. Reilly's was now bearing the brunt of the attack. Michael O'Flanagan was ordered to take a few men from C Company up here to bolster the position. When he finally made it here under fire, he had a bit of a run-in with Morris Collins, which according to Michael O'Flanagan went like this. So in Michael O'Flanagan's words, having surveyed the position, I told him I was not satisfied that the building offered reasonable security for the men under my command. He replied rather curtly to the effect, did I want to save my own skin? I told him that I was responsible for the safety of the men in my half section. I felt that apart from the fact that the building offered no fields of fire, it lacked all means of a safe retreat should we be called upon to vacate the premises quickly. He emphasised the fact that there was no intention of retreating, that our job was to fight to the finish, and that therefore the question of a line of retreat did not arise. O'Flanagan posted his men to the windows on the first floor here. The enemy kept us vigorously engaged with heavy rifle and machine gun fire, to which we replied vigorously. As we were proving such an obstacle to enemy forces, I realised that they were prepared to sacrifice any number of men to dislodge us. At that point, the British were getting closer by boring through houses. They were tunnelling through house by house. They also set up a machine gun post on what was Jervis Street Hospital on the roof there. So if everyone imagines where the Jervis Street Centre is now, you get a sense of it's quite a ways away. But the impact of the machine gun was that it pinned down the barricade outside here and also pinned down Reilly's fort. So Jack got word to Frank up the Malthouse Tower to concentrate his sights on that. And as the military records say, the machine gun was silenced. It's not something Grandpa ever spoke about. Growing up, I had no idea of how chaotic the fighting became at North King Street. After all, weren't these just the backroom boys? General John Maxwell actually described here as the scene of the fiercest fighting all week. The South Staffordshire Regiment took a right pasting, so much so that they took out their frustrations on the civilian population and murdered 16 local men who weren't involved in the fighting. If you haven't heard of the North King Street Massacre, I think it's a measure of how successful the Home Office in London was in stopping the word getting out. And it's a credit actually to the Smithfield Stoneybatter People's History Project that the 16 victims were remembered a couple of years ago in a plaque across the road. And among those names on the plaque, there are 4 unarmed men who were shot dead in 27 North King Street. James Finnegan, Patrick Hoey, James McCartney and Pather Lawless.
In Dublin town they murdered them, like dogs they shot them down. At Reilly's fort we held them off, till the last of us fell down. They say that in North King Street was the dirtiest fight of all, but that don't make life easier without you, Jim, my love.
It was months later when Frank and Jack were in jail and they heard what happened to Pather, and they deeply regretted not persuading him to come with them on the Easter Monday morning. And the irony of it, a young fella who went home to avoid trouble ends up getting murdered in cold blood by the forces of law and order. Nobody was ever held to account for the North King Street Massacre. By Friday, British troops got as far as the butcher's shop on Stirrup Lane. Michael O'Flanagan says they dragged the butcher out and shot him. A volunteer from the garrison, Paddy Farrell, was also shot dead by a British sniper. Other volunteers paint a picture of fighting on a new scale. Liam O'Doherty put it, "A few volunteers were standing at the window of Reilly's public house on the first floor. The British were working their way down from Bolton Street to our positions. To our surprise, an officer appeared from North King Street Post Office and shouted at his men to come out of their houses. About 10 or 12 of them came out, and he told them he was going to advance in our positions. Immediately, we started to fire on them. They turned everywhere and ran down a side street. I don't know if any of those British soldiers survived." Such downright stupidity. An officer shouting instructions to his men with the enemy looking on, listening to every word and preparing accordingly. Fighting on the city streets was a totally alien concept. I mean, these troops, British troops, had trained for trenched warfare, and here they were on the streets of Dublin. General Maxwell could have bypassed North King Street and isolated Reilly's fort, but just as what happened in Clanwilliam House over Northumberland Road, the sense was, rather than go around an obstacle, they had to go through it. And this was the only way. And if this was the mindset of the British officer class, it was the rank and file who paid the price. Fionn Lynch couldn't believe it either. He said, "Some of the soldiers who appeared to be very stupidly led, if they were led at all, came through the last house before Cuckoo Lane, which is down the road. About a dozen of them, and this was completely under our fire. Frank Shouldice, Lieutenant Shouldice's brother, was in the malt house just covering the place, absolutely. The lads were wiped out in no time. It was, of course, a tragic thing in many ways. One had to be sorry for them. They were young boys." And there was one particular memory that stuck with Jack when this happened. He said, "One young fellow still alive was moaning pitifully for his mother. What could I do to help him? Frank, unlike his brother, never made a statement to the Bureau of Military History. A lot of his friends didn't either. But it was a stroke of good fortune that historian Max Caulfield came over here when he wrote his brilliant book, The Easter Rebellion, and he sought out the participants as part of his research. So about 40 years after the Rising, Jack and Frank brought Max Caulfield down here, and they wanted to show him this is how North King Street played out. And Grandpa told Max Caulfield, about 15 Tommies turned into Beresford Street right under me. I was on the iron platform, and all I had to do was fire down upon them. One by one we knocked them all over. It was a terrible slaughter, and to this day I can't understand why they decided to rush things. And so strange actually to hear these words and to think that this is Grandpa. We're talking about Grandpa here, or Grandpa's talking about himself, and that was him up there in the Malthouse Tower. The same man who, for us at home, he checked on his grandchildren every night to see we were okay, and the day would round off with a sort of blessing, Ihawai Kulasov Banach Day. So maybe he thought Max Caulfield was a once-off. I don't know, it certainly was not a boast. I'll be very clear about that. He had pity for the young soldiers who came in within his range, even though they were sent to kill him. No mistake either. It was shoot or be shot. Like many others, Grandpa felt utter disdain for the officers who effectively sent these young men to their deaths. Not unlike what was happening on a grander scale in France and Belgium, where young conscripts were being sent out of the trenches into enemy fire like cannon fodder. There's no time anyway here to dwell on it. Sean Cody put it, the British suffered many casualties in dead and wounded and left behind a number of rifles, which were quickly collected and taken into Reilly's. Just before he got wounded, Nicholas Laughlin was a block away with G Company. He said, it was the worst night we had. I remember standing in a corner of Moore's factory on Friday night, and the rifle and machine gun fire from the enemy was so intense that to cross the room was certain death. Events were coming to a climax, no question, and Jack Shouldice felt the barricades facing both ends became untenable for our men who fell back into Reilly's fort. Throughout Friday and Saturday morning, the gunfire was practically continuous. We contained casualties at the crossing, losing a few men who were killed outright and a number wounded. And Michael O'Flanagan, he remembers the situation getting worse by the hour because the volunteers were running low on ammunition and there was no plan B. He said, we could attempt to get further supplies of ammunition and grenades from Father Matthew Hall, so you know where that is down below. Volunteers Delamere and Patrick O'Flanagan agreed to take the risk. They succeeded in reaching Church Street and we covered their crossing by vigorous rifle fire. So risking everything to get fresh supplies, the two men weaved their way down Church Street as far as Father Matthew Hall under heavy fire and taking cover behind barricades and doorways. It was nearly dawn by the time they were seen coming back up, with Delamere leading and Patrick O'Flanagan close behind. Michael O'Flanagan picks up the story and he says, volunteer Delamere managed to cross over successfully and gained entrance to the doorway of Reilly's fort without suffering any mishap. So you can literally picture him coming in the door. So Delamere comes in and then he says he was in possession of a number of slings of rifle ammunition and 4 homemade grenades. Volunteer Patrick O'Flanagan succeeded in crossing the street, but as he reached the door of Reilly's fort, he got the full contents of a machine gun burst. Jack actually then goes to the door and drags him in, so he was resting on the floor, but it was too late. Michael continues, he was killed outright. We managed to bring his body into the shop and found that he was in possession of a number of slings of ammunition and 2 homemade grenades. At about 8 o'clock, a doctor from the Richmond Hospital, accompanied by Father Albert of Capuchin Friary, arrived and attended to volunteer O'Flanagan. Incidentally, he adds, volunteer O'Flanagan was my brother. Saturday. F Company had held out here till Saturday morning, by which stage most volunteer positions around the country had fallen. What they had achieved wasn't lost on Pearse Beasley. who said, "I spent the night at the barricade above the church praying that the gallant band at Reilly's fort would be able to hold out. Day dawned and still the indomitable little band held their own. They were under fire most of the time for 15 or 16 hours. I was shocked by their haggard, ghastly appearance, showing the strain they'd been under." So under heavy fire from all sides, Jack felt there was no option. He said, "Through death, wounds and illness, and I may add, exhaustion, after nearly 2 days, the continuous defence of the position, our little garrison had been reduced to 7 or 8 weary and almost stupefied men, some of us with practically no sleep since Wednesday. With no rest possible, ammunition nearly gone and no sign of reinforcements, it was decided to fall back to the next barricade on Church Street." So with Grandpa giving covering fire from the Malthouse Tower, they made their escape on a coordinated, they jumped out the street level windows as one man and made a dash across the barricade down as far as Father Matthew Hall. Then Grandpa retreated from the Malthouse Tower to St. Michan's Church, also to the Bell Tower down there, and after that what was left of F Company went to the Four Courts to get some rest. General Maxwell's military career was in tatters. He reported to Field Marshal John French at the end of the week. He said the troops had a trying time dealing with the numerous snipers, owing to the considerable opposition at barricades, especially in North King Street. It was not until 9 a.m. on the 29th of April that the Four Courts area was completely surrounded. The order to surrender came in from Patrick Pearse. For the record, the Four Courts Garrison did not want to surrender, but Ned Daly said they would do it the proper way and follow orders. So surrender they did. Reilly's fort here was at this stage a shattered building and now occupied by British troops. G Company, now led by Gary Holohan, burrowed from North Brunswick Street with the intention of actually retaking Reilly's fort. And only when they verified that the order from Patrick Pearse was genuine, they decided reluctantly to call it a day. Sean O'Duffy put it very simply. He said, "We marched to the corner of North King Street and left down our arms and equipment in the street." His comrade Sean Cody later remarked with justifiable pride, "G Company of the 1st Battalion was the last to surrender." Easter week was over. Typical of so many others who, of that time, Grandpa spoke rarely about this experience. Researching the book sometimes felt like getting to know him better second time around. I also came to understand that if the men and women who had taken part in the rising wanted to speak about it, they talked to each other, and that's what they did. They felt people they trusted, people who knew what they were talking about because they had been there as well. As those who had stood alongside Grandpa and Jack through Easter week had to count on each other because their lives literally depended on each other. So it really shouldn't come as too much of a surprise when someone like Michael O'Flanagan, who fought from these very windows and whose younger brother Patrick was shot and killed in the doorway outside, and despite that loss, Michael O'Flanagan looked back on it all and he said, "I have no regrets." He said, "The years I spent and the people I met in the national movement, life would not have been life without it." So, for an extraordinary week that Jack's men stood their ground, there's one particularly memorable event I want to leave you with. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, pretty quiet. Thursday begins hotting up. Friday, pandemonium. The British try and take here and they pay a heavy price. The volunteers in this building, running short of ammunition and food, deprived of sleep for days, are somehow still hanging on, just about. And they can see O'Connell Street in flames, lighting up the night sky. They're outnumbered 20 to 1, not knowing when or how this might all end. A small company of weary and utterly exhausted men at Reilly's fort and at the barricade outside. Suddenly, the sound comes to them from on high. It's the snatch of a song. And Jack hears it and he recognises it because he knows the song. It's the Pride of Petravore. Jack knows it because he knows the song and he knows the voice. It's Frank singing up in the Malthouse Tower. baritone caught in the breeze, filtering through to the street below. Grandpa finishes off with another one of his favourites, The Men of the West. And sometimes I imagine him singing this defiantly. I don't know, but I suppose the image that really fits or that presents itself is him lying in the stairwell, just utterly exhausted, beyond exhaustion, and it's more like Grandpa is singing to himself. I give you the gallant old West, boys, we're rallied our bravest and best. When Ireland lay broken and bleeding, hurrah for the men of the West. And down below it's like Jack and his men are buoyed, they're revived by the spirit of it, that they catch it and they're brought back to life. And the British troops up at Bow Street do not like it one bit when Jack and the boys at the barricade pick up the song and join in the chorus. So what began as a midnight serenade turns into a boisterous sing-song. When Ireland lay broken and bleeding, hurrah for the men of the West. And they're singing from the heart, calling into the night sky, feeling they've achieved something, whatever that may be. They feel it, not knowing at this point what's around the corner or to what tomorrow might bring, but the night is theirs, and never again will they feel so alive. So, the next time you're walking down North King Street or driving by the tap here, spare a thought for those 6 long nights in Reilly's fort. And if you have a drink today, you might raise a glass to a remarkable group of Irish men and women who at personal sacrifice uncounted put their lives on the line so that future generations, us, would be free. Gurmagadh.